The morning Mariana left Cedar Creek, the sun barely had the courage to rise. She walked out before anyone could see her go. Eyes dry, heart like stone, because that town had already decided who she was. The neighbors crossed the street. The women looked away. The man who had ruined her life, gone, untouched, smiling somewhere. And Mariana was left with a sick mother, a pile of bills, and one door still open. A stranger's proposal, not love, a contract. Marry a man she'd never met, live on his ranch for 1 year, walk away with her life back. She said yes. And what happened behind those fences, nobody saw coming. Not her, not him, especially not the town that had already buried her. If you're already hooked, you belong here. Subscribe so you don't miss where this goes, and drop in the comments what city you're watching from. I read every single one. Now let's get into it. The sun rose differently that morning over Cedar Creek. It was one of those pale October suns, unhurried, that slid along the edge of the hills, as if it too didn't want to witness what was about to happen. The mist still lay on the ground when Mariana Ferreira left the house before the roosters had finished crowing. Her eyes dry and her heart so heavy it felt like it had been carved from stone. She was 23 years old. She wore her black hair in a simple bun, her hands calloused from working the garden since childhood, and her brown eyes still carried a light that everyone in town used to recognize. People said Mariana had the look of someone who believes, someone who hasn't yet learned that the world sometimes smiles at you just to hit you harder afterward. She had learned. She had learned the hardest way possible. 6 months before, Rodrigo Cavanaugh had arrived in Cedar Creek in a truck nobody in town had ever seen the equal of. Black, enormous, with tinted windows and wheels that gleamed even in the mud. Son of a politician, owner of land across the county, a man in dress clothes in a place where nobody wore a tie even to a funeral. He arrived smiling, with easy words and money spread around like he wasn't counting. He bought drinks for the whole bar, promised work to half the men in town, and looked at Mariana with a way that she, in the innocence she still had, mistook for genuine interest. He courted her for 3 months, brought flowers, sent messages, showed up at church every Sunday, and waited outside for her to come out. Mariana's mother, Mrs. Conchesson, a woman who had raised 4 children alone after her husband died of an early heart attack, was overcome with joy. "My daughter, God hasn't forgotten us," she would say, holding Mariana's hands in the small kitchen, the wood stove smoking and the smell of fresh brewed coffee in the air. "This man has means, has a future. He'll take you out of this tight life." Mariana resisted as long as she could, but Rodrigo was clever in the way only bad men know how to be, patient on the surface, calculating underneath. When she finally opened her heart to him, when she finally believed in the marriage promises he whispered in her ear on Sunday afternoons under the pecan tree in the yard, it was too late. He disappeared for 6 weeks after that. 6 weeks during which Mariana waited, sent word, asked her cousin to drive into town to see if something had happened to him. 6 weeks until she found out, through the dirty mouth of Mrs. Mertes, the town's chief gossip, who knew everything before it happened and never missed a chance to spread misery, that Rodrigo Cavanaugh was married. He had a wife, had 2 kids, and had used Cedar Creek as entertainment between one business trip and the next. The town did not forgive Mariana. That was what hurt most. Not the man's betrayal, that was the pain she carried inside, silent, bleeding slowly, like a wound that doesn't close. What was killing her was the look in people's eyes. Neighbors who used to greet her now crossed the street. Men who muttered when she walked by. Women who shielded their children as if she were contagious. Mrs. Gerald, who lived on the other side of the fence and had always chatted with her mother every afternoon, stopped coming by. No explanation, not even a goodbye. And Mariana's mother got sick, Mrs. Conceição had always been strong as hardwood, the kind of woman who cries in the dark so she doesn't scare her children, and by morning is already up before everyone else making coffee. But the shame that had fallen on the family, the pressure of the town, the debt that had piled up believing things would improve, all of it wore her down the way rain wears down stone. In August, she had the first high blood pressure episode that kept her 3 days in bed. In September, the Cedar Creek doctor, a young man who only held office 2 days a week and who had more goodwill than equipment, said she needed continuous medication, lab tests in the city, and rest. As if rest were possible when the grocery tab was close to $2,000 and the garden harvest barely covered the water bill. That was when the emissary from August Drummond appeared. Mariana was in line at the county clinic on a Tuesday morning in October, waiting to pick up her mother's prescription, when a man in his 50s, grey-haired and wearing a worn but clean jacket, approached and asked, with a courtesy she did not expect, "Are you Mariana Ferreira, Mrs. Conceição's daughter?" She said yes guardedly, because guardedness had become her natural state of being. The man introduced himself as Benedict, manager of Santa Cruz Ranch, the largest property in the neighboring county of Hartwell. He said his employer, Mr. August Venancio Drummond, was looking for a woman of good character for a formal marriage proposal. It wasn't love. He made that clear with a disconcerting frankness. It was a contract. Mr. August needed to present a wife to his family within 90 days to secure his rights to the ranch's inheritance, per a clause in his late father's will. In exchange, the woman would receive housing, support, the protection of his name, and a sum of money deposited in her own account. Mariana looked at that man for a long moment. The sun was coming in sideways on the clinic porch, and a child was crying inside, and the smell of disinfectant mixed with the smell of wet earth that the wind brought in from the street. "Does your employer know who I am?" she asked. "Does he know what people say about me here?" Benedict did not look away. "He knows everything, Miss Mariana. That's precisely why he asked me to come speak with you." She went home, carrying that information like a stone. She stayed awake all night, staring at the wooden ceiling of the room she shared with her younger sister, listening to her mother's breathing in the next room, heavier than it should be. She thought about Rodrigo. She thought about the neighbors. She thought about the grocery tab. She thought about the cardiologist appointment her mother needed, which cost $200 just for the consultation, not counting the tests. The next morning, she sent word back with Benedict that she wanted to meet the man before giving any answer. That was the minimum her dignity still demanded. Santa Cruz Ranch was 42 miles from Cedar Creek, down a dirt road that turned to dust in the dry and to mud in the rain. Benedict came to get her in an old truck that ran well, and during the drive didn't say much, only answered what she asked with an objectivity she came to respect. August Venancio Drummond was 41 years old. He had inherited from his father the ranch and the burden of being the only son of a stubborn man who distrusted everyone. Old Ernesto Drummond had included in his will, written in his own hand and notarized, a clause stipulating, if August was not married by the time he turned 42, his birthday was in 93 days. The ranch would be divided equally between two of the deceased's nephews, sons of a sister who lived in Dallas, and who had for years been trying to swallow the property by legal and illegal means. Old Ernesto had put that clause in because he believed a married son was a responsible son. He had written that too, in that crooked and authoritarian style that was the Drummond family trademark. August was a man whom life had taught to distrust tenderness. He had married once, at 28, to a woman from the city who had lasted 2 years on the ranch before leaving without a written explanation, only a letter that said she had been born for the city and that there was nothing at Santa Cruz she could love. He had doubled down on work after that, woke before sunrise, slept after everyone else, and tended to the cattle and the land with an attention he had never again directed at anyone. When Mariana arrived at the ranch, August was repairing a fence in the east pasture. Benedict went to call him, and she waited on the porch of the main house, an old building of exposed brick and dark wood, with tall windows and an enormous oak tree in the yard that must have been more than 50 years old. The house was large, was solid, but had a kind of sadness settled over it, like dust on furniture nobody uses. He arrived with his hands dirty with earth and his shirt with a grease stain on the shoulder. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face burned by the sun and a few days' beard that wasn't neglect. It was simply the face of a man who had more urgent things to think about than his appearance. His eyes were an unusual grey-green, and when they settled on Mariana, she did not see desire. She saw assessment. Careful, fair, without malice. He wiped his hands on the rag he kept in his pocket and said, without preamble, "I heard what happened to you in Cedar Creek." Mariana lifted her chin. It was an automatic reflex she had developed in recent months, lifting her chin whenever she felt someone was going to use her story as a weapon. "And you came to offer me charity?" she said, and the word came out with a bitterness she couldn't hide. August shook his head slightly. "No, I came to offer you a deal. Charity isn't what I have to give. And it isn't what you need. You need a clean name and money. I need a wife on paper. It's a trade." She stood looking at him. The oak tree cast shade and the wind moved the leaves with a sound that was almost music. "You said you heard what happened. Then you know what the town says about me." "I do. And you still want to marry a woman the town has already condemned." "I'm not marrying the town." He said it without pride, without affectation. In the same objective way, he said everything. "I'm marrying you or I'm not marrying anyone. What they say is none of my business." She held her breath for a second. Not because he had said something beautiful. It wasn't beautiful. It was simply true. And it was precisely because it was plain, unvarnished truth, without the wrapping of false romanticism, that she felt it like a gentle blow to the chest. "You promise you won't touch me," she said, and the voice came out firmer than she expected. "I promise on everything I have." He did not look away. "You'll have your room, your privacy, your money. When the necessary period ends, 1 year so as not to raise suspicion, you can leave if you want, with everything agreed upon, and I won't owe you anything, nor you me." She looked at the house, looked at the oak tree, looked at his hands, the hands of a working man, not a man who sits behind a desk pushing papers. She thought about her mother. She thought about the grocery tab. She thought about a place where people didn't know her, didn't know the story, didn't look at her the way they looked at her. "I accept," she said, "but I have one condition." "What is it?" "My mother needs medical treatment, a cardiologist, tests, ongoing medication. That goes into the agreement." He didn't think twice. "It does." And so, beneath an old oak tree on a ranch that smelled of earth and wet grass, Mariana Ferreira agreed to marry a stranger. Not for love, for survival, for dignity, for a deep instinct she couldn't explain, but that said, in the quiet bottom of her heart, that this man was at least honest about what he wanted. And honesty, she had learned the hard way, was a far rarer thing than love. The wedding was done at the courthouse in Hartwell on a Wednesday morning with little wind. Present were only Benedict, who signed as witness, and Mariana's mother, who cried throughout the ceremony with a mixture of relief and fear she couldn't quite separate. Mrs. Conchesson had asked her daughter the night before, while the two of them folded clothes into a bag, "Are you sure about this, my daughter?" And Mariana had answered, "I don't know if I'm sure, Mom. I know it's the only path that appeared, and when there's only one path, you can't just stand still." Mrs. Conchesson would stay in the little house in Cedar Creek, which August had arranged to be fixed up. New roof, fresh plaster on the walls, bathroom repaired, and would receive a monthly amount for her care. The cardiologist appointment was scheduled for the following week. When the car left Cedar Creek with Mariana inside it, she looked through the back window at the dirt road, the low houses, the dust the vehicle raised. She didn't feel nostalgia. She felt something stranger, a kind of clean emptiness, like when you finish crying and discover that on the other side of the tears there is a silence that is not sadness. The room August had prepared for her was in the east wing of the house, the farthest from his room, separated by a hallway and a small sitting room between the two spaces. It had a window facing the yard, a double bed with a firm mattress, a dark wood wardrobe that smelled of cedar, and an old vanity with a mirror slightly spotted at the edges. On that first night, Mariana lay awake listening to the sounds of the ranch. The distant lowing of cattle, the call of an owl, the wind bending the trees with a soft creak. They were sounds completely different from the sounds of Cedar Creek, where she had slept all her life listening to the neighbors' dogs and the trucks on the highway. Here it was different. Here the silence had texture. She waited for the fear of being in that house with that man to come. She had spent months in fear, fear of people's judgment, fear of going out, fear of her own shadow. But the fear she expected that night, that specific fear of being in an unfamiliar place with a man she barely knew, did not arrive with the force she had imagined. There was an underlying tension, yes, an instinctive vigilance that made her listen to every sound in the hallway. But the hours passed and nothing happened, and the sounds of the ranch became familiar, and at some point before dawn, she fell asleep without knowing when. In the morning, when she came downstairs, August had already gone out to the pasture. There was a woman in the kitchen, Teresa, in her mid-40s, who had worked on the ranch for more than a decade and who looked at Mariana with a direct but not hostile appraisal. "Good morning," Teresa said. "The boss said to give you breakfast when you woke up. There's bread, cheese, and fruit." "Thank you." Mariana sat in the large wooden chair at the kitchen table and looked around. The kitchen was big, with a wood stove and a gas range side by side, wooden shelves with jars of staples, and a low window that faced the yard where the oak tree swayed its leaves in the morning breeze. "Can you cook?" Teresa asked bluntly. "Yes." "Good, because here the food is simple but has to be plentiful. The boss doesn't complain, but the ranch hands eat a lot." Mariana realized there was no protocol of introduction in that house, no ceremony or formality. It was a working ranch, and the people who lived in it were working people, and what she did or didn't do would be clear in actions, not words. She appreciated that. In the first days, she watched more than she acted. She learned the routine. Breakfast before 6, lunch at noon sharp, simple supper at 7. She learned that Benedict was the second most important man on the ranch after August, who handled administrative matters with a seriousness that concealed a dry and gentle humor. She learned that the ranch hands, 8 in total who lived in 2 bunkhouses at the back of the property, were serious, hard-working men who treated her with respect without excess. And she learned that August Venancio Drummond was a man of his word. He never violated her space, never entered the East Wing hallway without reason. At meals, he talked about the ranch, the cattle, the weather, practical, concrete subjects, which she answered with the same objectivity. There was no forced intimacy, but there was no deliberate coldness either. It was a kind of respectful neutrality that, paradoxically, Mariana found more comforting than any performative affection would have been. There was one thing, however, she had not anticipated. She could not stay idle. She came from a working family, raised in a household where idleness was almost a sin, where every pair of hands could be useful and every ounce of energy could be directed toward something. In Cedar Creek, she had worked in the garden, helped at her cousin's store, given private math lessons to 2 children in the neighborhood. Here, In the first days, she didn't know what to do with the hours, and the emptiness bothered her more than anything else. On the afternoon of the fourth day, she asked Teresa for permission to use the kitchen garden, which had been abandoned and overtaken by weeds. "You can use whatever you like," Teresa said, with an expression Mariana read as quiet approval. She went to get a hoe from the barn, found old gloves hanging on a nail, and spent the whole afternoon clearing the bed. When August came back from the pasture at dusk and passed through the yard, she was on her knees in the dirt, planting basil seedlings she had found in a broken pot near the fence. He stopped. He stood looking for a moment. "That's gonna grow," he said, not as praise but as a statement. "It will," she answered, without lifting her eyes from the earth. "With water and sun, it grows." There was a pause. Then he went to the porch to wash his hands before supper, and she was left with the strange feeling that a conversation had occurred that was not only about plants, but it was too early to understand what it was. The 20th day at the ranch began like the others, sun coming in early through the east window, the smell of coffee rising from the kitchen, the distant sound of cattle being driven to the new pasture. Mariana was in the garden, which already showed the first rows of lettuce and cilantro in organized lines, when Benedict appeared by the side fence with an expression she had learned to recognize as trouble. Brow furrowed, step faster than usual. "Miss Mariana," he said, stopping at a respectful distance, "there's a visitor at the front gate. Says he's an acquaintance of yours, from Cedar Creek." She felt the chill before she heard the name. Rodrigo Cavanaugh. The world stopped for a second. She slowly put down the hoe, wiped her hands on her pants, felt her breathing harden in her chest like drying cement. "What does he want?" He didn't say, but he's not alone. He has 2 men with him. Benedict hesitated. "The boss isn't here. He went into town to do errands at the supply store. I can send him away if you'd like." "No." She said it before thinking, and after saying it she understood why. Sending him away without knowing what he wanted was showing fear. And she had spent months in fear. She was tired of fear. "I'll speak to him myself." Benedict paused, assessing, then nodded in a gesture that was half agreement, half warning. "I'll come along." Rodrigo Cavanaugh was leaning against a different vehicle than she had known, a silver SUV with 2 men who had the kind of build that serves as intimidating decoration. He wore a collared shirt, open at the neck, and sunglasses, and when he saw her coming down the entrance drive, he smiled with that rehearsed ease she now saw with different eyes. Eyes that had already passed through fire and could tell the difference between a candle flame and a wildfire. "Mariana," he took off the glasses as if that made the encounter more intimate. "What a surprise, huh? I never imagined seeing you in a place like this." "What do you want, Rodrigo?" she said, and her voice came out flat. It didn't tremble. She noticed that with something approaching pride, he looked around, at the ranch entrance, the well-kept fences, the iron gate. Just came to take a look. Heard about the wedding, found it strange. The smile became thinner, colder. A man like August Drummond marrying a girl like you, with so much history ahead of her. What history? The Cedar Creek story, Mariana. People talk, you know. And when people talk, things sometimes reach the wrong ears. The ears of your husband's family, for instance. The ears of lawyers who know the clauses of old Ernesto's will. He paused with the care of someone setting a knife on the table slowly. It would be a shame if someone raised questions about the legitimacy of this marriage, don't you think? It was a threat, dressed up as conversation, perfumed with insinuation, but it was a naked threat. He wanted what? Money? Her? Some advantage over August he didn't yet understand? She opened her mouth to respond, and it was then that the sound of August's truck came down the dirt road, raising dust. The vehicle stopped. August got out without hurrying, with a box of supplies under his arm that he set on the hood before walking toward them. He wasn't running. He showed no urgency. But there was something in the way he moved, direct, without deviation, like someone raised on land that is his and who knows it in every bone, that made Rodrigo's two men instinctively step back half a pace. August stopped beside Mariana, not between her and Rodrigo, beside her, shoulder to shoulder, in a position that said everything without needing words. "Who are you?" he asked Rodrigo, in a voice that was the same temperature. Neither warm nor cold, simply firm as a stone wall. Rodrigo put his glasses back on. "Rodrigo Kavanagh, old friend of your wife's." "Friend." August repeated the word as if examining it under a magnifying glass. "Friends give notice before showing up. Friends don't arrive with bodyguards on someone else's property." He turned his gaze back to Rodrigo with a calm that was more threatening than any agitation would have been. "What do you want here?" Rodrigo smiled, but the smile had gotten smaller. "Just wanted to pay my respects to Mariana. Heard about the wedding and wanted to—" "You've paid them." August took one step, just one. "Now leave. Look, I don't think you understand the situation." "I understand it perfectly." August's voice didn't rise. That was the most frightening detail. It was always the same size, the same weight. "You went to Cedar Creek, deceived this woman who was standing beside you, destroyed her reputation, and disappeared. Now you show up here thinking you'll use her story to get some advantage." A pause. "You're wrong." Rodrigo stared at August for a moment, measuring. August didn't look away. He was the kind of man who didn't look away. "This is going to cost you," Rodrigo said, and the threat was now direct, unwrapped. "I've heard that before." August turned slightly toward Benedict, who had appeared with two more ranch hands behind him. "Benedict, see the visitor to the road." Rodrigo left, not before casting one last glance at Mariana, a glance that had more of a message than a farewell. But he left. When the car disappeared around the bend in the dirt road, Mariana realized she had been holding her breath. She let it out all at once, slowly. August turned to her. "Are you all right?" "I am." A pause. "Thank you." He made a gesture that was almost a shrug, the gesture of someone who did what was obvious to do and doesn't understand why it would need thanks. "You're under my name now. That means what happens to you concerns me." He picked up the box of supplies from the hood. "Let's go to lunch." She stood still for a second, looking at the road where Rodrigo's car had disappeared. Then she turned and followed August. That day, something changed. It wasn't love. It was far too early for love. But it was something. It was the feeling that for the first time in months she had faced Rodrigo Kavanagh without trembling, and that she had not faced him alone. It was a beginning. October turned to November. November turned to December. Mariana's garden flourished as she had promised. First the basil, then the cilantro, then the lettuce and arugula and cherry tomatoes she planted in pots along the porch. Teresa's kitchen began acquiring fresh ingredients that before had to come from town. And Teresa, without ever saying so directly, because she was a woman of few words when it came to compliments, began leaving a space on the stove, always reserved for Mariana's recipes. It was a small thing, but in the small things was the great transformation. The main house of Santa Cruz Ranch, which when Mariana arrived had seemed like a museum inhabited by a single solitary man, began acquiring a kind of new breath. She made no dramatic renovations. She had no authority for that, and even if she had, it wasn't her style. But she began opening windows that had remained closed, replacing dried flowers in the vases with living ones from the garden, fixing the hinge on the hallway door that had been creaking for months and that everyone had stopped noticing because silence sometimes makes people blind as well. One afternoon, she found in a drawer in the sitting room a box of old photographs, black and white and sepia photos, some in faded color, of the Drummond family. Old Ernesto Young with his wife, August as a child, about 8 years old, mounted on a horse nearly the same size as him, with a smile she had never seen on his adult face. Birthday parties, a prize cow at an agricultural fair, the ranch in different decades, growing, changing, but always recognizable. She took the box to the sitting room and began organizing the photos carefully, putting them in order, sorting decades. When August came in from the pasture and saw what she was doing, he stopped in the doorway without entering. "Found that in the cabinet?" he said. "In a drawer. Sorry if I shouldn't have gone through it." "It's fine." But he stayed still. She noticed he was looking at the box with an expression that was neither quite sadness nor quite joy. It was the expression of someone looking at something that carries weight. "Sit for a while," she said. It wasn't an order. It was an invitation. The kind that leaves room for the other person to say no. He came in, sat in the armchair beside her, and she began showing him the photos she had sorted, asking names, dates, stories. And he began answering, first with short sentences, then slowly, with longer ones. He told about his father, a difficult man, fair but hard, who loved the ranch more than he loved people, perhaps because the ranch never disappointed the way people disappointed. He told about his mother, who had died when he was 15, and who was the only person old Ernesto had loved in a way anyone could see. He told about the first horse he had ridden alone, which was exactly the one in the photo, a bay called Thunder, who was gentle despite his name. She listened to everything, didn't interrupt, didn't offer an opinion where none was asked, simply listened, with the genuine attention of someone who knows that some stories need a witness before they can rest. When he was done, it was getting dark outside. The sun had gone down behind the hills, and the sky was the color of burned orange. "You never talk about yourself," he said, out of nowhere. She was quiet for a moment. "You never ask." "I'm asking now." She kept looking at the photo of August as a child on the horse. "What do you want to know?" "What you like to do before everything happened." It was a question nobody had asked. Not her mother, not the friends who had disappeared, not the doctor, not Benedict. Nobody had thought to ask what she liked. Everyone had focused on what had happened to her, on what she needed now, on what she was going to do going forward. "I like to read," she said. "Anything. Novels, encyclopedias, medicine labels. If it had words, I read it." A pause. "I like to teach too. I tutored kids in the neighborhood, math mainly. There was a boy, little Paul, who everyone said was stupid, that he'd never learn. But it was just that nobody had tried the right way with him. When I found the right way for him, he learned his multiplication tables in 2 weeks." August was quiet for a moment. "There's a bookshelf in the study. It's been locked, but the key is on the nail in the hallway. You can use it whenever you want." She turned her face to him with a surprise she couldn't hide. He was already getting up from the armchair with that manner of his, practical, without fuss. "Good night," he said. "Good night," she answered. And she sat there while he left, with the photos spread over her lap and her heart beating a little differently than usual, unable to explain exactly why. The following night, she went to the study, took the key from the nail, opened the door, and stood in the entrance for nearly a full minute. It was a medium-sized room, with the smell of old paper and wood, lit by a copper lampshade over a heavy writing desk. And on the walls, from floor to ceiling, there were shelves, dozens, perhaps 100 books, literature, history, agronomy, philosophy, atlases, dictionaries. Some with the spine worn from much use, others with the look of never having been opened. She chose a novel, one of the classic American books she had tried to read once but hadn't finished, and took it to her room. She read until 2 in the morning, and when she closed the book and turned off the light, she smiled in the dark. It was the first time in many months she had smiled without it costing her something. December arrived with dry heat, and news that made Mariana sit in a chair and hold the phone for a long moment after hanging up. Mrs. Conceição had done the tests. The cardiologist had read the results, had adjusted the medication, and had said, with the caution doctors use when they want to say something good without raising too many expectations, that Mrs. Conceição's heart was responding well to treatment, that with the right medications and without the stress she had carried for years, there was good prospect. Mariana went to the yard. She stood under the oak tree, and she cried, not from sadness, but with that cry of someone who has carried a stone for so long that when it falls, the body doesn't immediately know what to do with its own weight. Teresa found her there, and without a word, went to fetch a glass of cool water and left it near her. Then went back to the kitchen. It was the kind of kindness that needs no name. When August came in for lunch and found Mariana's eyes red, he only asked, "Good news or bad?" "Good," she said. He nodded and went to wash his hands for lunch. But during the meal, discreetly, he served her plate before his own, which he had never done before. She noticed, said nothing, but she noticed. January on the ranch was the month of big decisions, the time to decide what to plant, what to renovate, which cattle to keep and which to sell, which supply contracts to renew. August spent hours at the study desk with Benedict, surrounded by papers and notebooks, and often the discussion lasted until evening. One afternoon, Mariana was sweeping the hallway when she heard, through the half-open study door, August and Benedict discussing a contract with a dairy middleman who was charging a commission Benedict found excessive, but which August was reluctant to renegotiate because of an old verbal commitment. She swept the entire hallway, turned the corner, stopped. She went back to the door, knocked with her knuckles. August and Benedict looked up. The expression on both their faces was slight surprise. She had never interrupted their work. "Sorry," she said. "I wasn't trying to listen, but I heard about the middleman." A pause. A verbal commitment isn't a contract. If it wasn't signed, it has no legal validity, and the man knows that. He's using your word against your own wallet. There was a silence. Benedict and August exchanged glances. "How do you know that?" August asked. "I learned from reading." She made a vague gesture toward the bookshelf he had unlocked. "There's a contract law book in there that had the spine nearly broken. I imagine you read it before." August's lips moved. It didn't quite become a full smile, but it was the closest she had seen. "Years ago, yes. Then you already know. You just need to remember." She left, went back to her broom, and heard from the hallway Benedict say in a low voice, but not low enough, "That woman, boss." And August said nothing in response. But Mariana imagined, the way you imagine the sun existing even when the clouds are heavy, that there was something in his silence that was not indifference. The contract with the middleman was renegotiated. August secured a 12% reduction in the commission. Benedict, in his discreet way that was his specialty, informed Mariana of this one morning while she was picking tomatoes. "Good," was all she said. "He wants to know if you would be interested in sitting in on the planning meetings," Benedict said. "He won't ask directly because that's not his way, but I know it's what he wants to ask." She looked at the old manager with an affection that had been growing without her noticing. "You translate very well what he doesn't say. 20 years of practice." Benedict gave a smile that was almost a wrinkle of approval. "So, you can tell him yes." From then on, she began attending the planning meetings. First only listening, then asking questions, then, when she noticed August listened to her questions with genuine attention and didn't dismiss them as interference, beginning to offer suggestions. She had a natural eye for numbers, inherited from who knows where, perhaps from the father who had died young, but whom her mother always described as a man with a good head for figures. The ranch became more efficient. Small changes, an optimized delivery route here, a supply negotiation renegotiated there, that added up to real savings. August never said "you're right" in those exact words, but he implemented what she suggested. And implementing was better than any verbal praise. In the second week of February, something happened that Mariana had neither planned nor foreseen. It was night. She had stayed late in the study reading, as had become her custom, and when she turned off the light and went down the dark hallway toward her room, she tripped on the threshold of the sitting room door, a wooden edge that was slightly raised and which she had thought to mention to Benedict but had forgotten. The fall wasn't serious. She fell to the side, managed to protect her face with her arm, and what hurt most was her pride and her knee. But the noise was enough that seconds later, the door to August's room at the end of the hallway opened. He came with a flashlight, the kind of man who sleeps lightly, as if part of his mind is always awake listening to the ranch. He lit up the hallway and found her sitting on the floor, holding her knee. What happened? His voice was calm, but she heard urgency underneath. "I tripped. I'm fine." She tried to get up by herself, but her knee protested. He crouched down without asking permission, without the kind of hesitation that would have existed at the beginning, that hesitation of someone who knows he shouldn't cross a line, but also without unnecessary touch. He simply placed one hand under her arm, steady, so she could lean on it while she stood up. And she leaned on it, naturally, without thinking, as if it was something she had done before. When she was on her feet, both their hands separated. The distance between them was less than it had been in the previous months. Not physically, which was nearly the same, but in another dimension that has no exact name. The dimension where people pass from strangers to something different from strangers. "I'll have Benedict look at that threshold tomorrow," he said. "That's what I was going to say. I forgot. Don't forget again." She looked up at him in the dark hallway, lit only by the flashlight's reflection. And she saw, perhaps for the first time with clarity, that this man was not what she had imagined at the beginning. She had imagined someone cold, calculating, who used the contract as a transaction and treated her as part of the inventory. She had prepared herself for that. What she had found was different. It was a lonely man who had learned not to show loneliness because loneliness, in the world where he grew up, was weakness. A man who kept his word not because he feared consequences, but because it was who he was. A man who had spent the previous months learning her without her noticing, learning the time she liked to be in the garden, the book she was reading, the way she took her coffee, without sugar, which had surprised Teresa at first. "Good night," she said. "Good night." He stayed until she entered her room. Only then did he go. She lay in bed unable to sleep for quite some time. Not from fear, from something else entirely. It was on a March morning, the day after her 6-month anniversary at the ranch. Mariana woke early as always and came downstairs to the kitchen. Teresa hadn't arrived yet. The morning was cool, with low mist over the pastures, and she stood on the porch with her coffee, listening to the silence that always precedes the sounds of the ranch waking up. She was thinking about a supply management problem she had identified the week before, an inconsistency in the feed inventory that might be causing waste, when she heard a different sound. Not the lowing of cattle, not the engine of a tractor. It was a high, quick sound she couldn't immediately identify. Then she heard the voices. It was the ranch hands in the yard beside the barn speaking loudly. It wasn't a fight. It was that specific tone of when there's urgency, of when something has happened. She put the coffee mug on the porch railing and went over. August had left at 5 in the morning for the north pasture, the most remote part of the ranch, where there was a stretch of fence that needed urgent repair. He had gone on horseback, as he did when the stretch was too far for the truck to reach easily, and the horse had come back alone. Only the horse. Mariana stood looking at the animal. The bay, which was the one August used most often, quiet and seemingly balanced. For a second that felt much longer. The saddle was in place. One of the reins was broken. "Has anyone gone out there?" she asked. "Joe Antonio just left in the truck," said one of the ranch hands, Arlindo, who was the most senior after Benedict. "But the road to the north pasture is rough. It'll take a while." "Call Benedict. He went to town yesterday. He won't be back until noon." She stood still for exactly 3 seconds. Then she went to the barn, grabbed the first aid kit Benedict had shown her weeks before, told Arlindo she was going to the north pasture, and went. Arlindo came along. She didn't even ask. He simply came, which she would later think was one of the simplest forms of human kindness. They found August almost 2 miles away, in a low point where the old fence had given way, along with a section of embankment. He had fallen with the horse when the ground gave way under the hooves, and the animal had managed to free itself and return. August was conscious. That was the first thing she verified, arriving before Arlindo, who stayed behind, getting the truck positioned on a bad slope. But his left leg was pinned under a wooden fence beam, and he had a deep cut on his temple that had bled quite a bit. "August!" She arrived on her knees beside him in the mud. She used his name for the first time without the formal address, and neither of them noticed in the moment. "Can you hear me?" "I can." The voice was low, but firm. That stubborn firmness that was his nature. "My leg is pinned. I can't." "I know. Easy. Let me look." She opened the kit, put on gloves, examined the cut on his head first. Deep, but not arterial. The bleeding had slowed. Then she looked at the leg. The wooden beam was heavy. She wasn't going to be able to lift it alone. Arlindo arrived. With a piece of iron he had taken from the truck's rear compartment, the kind of improvisation that only makes sense to someone raised on a ranch, they made a lever. With effort, with August suppressing what must have been considerable pain while they moved the wood, they managed to free the leg. The fracture was clear. The bone hadn't broken through the skin, but the wrong angle of the leg was unmistakable. She immobilized it with what she had, bandages, 2 thin pieces of wood, and with Arlindo they carried August to the truck. During the entire drive into town, while Arlindo drove at the speed the rough road allowed, she stayed in the back seat with August, his hand resting on hers, not for her to hold him, but because at some point during the drive he had done that, and she had not withdrawn her hand. "You'll be okay," she said once. "I know." A pause. "You came quickly." "Of course I did." He closed his eyes for a stretch, but he didn't let go of her hand. The tibia fracture was serious, but not irreparable. The orthopedic surgeon in Hartwell, a quiet and competent man in his 50s, operated the same day, inserted a pin and plate, and said recovery would take 8 to 12 weeks, no walking, no weight on the leg. Rest. Later, physical therapy. August stayed in the hospital 2 days. She stayed both days at the hospital, going home only once to get clothes and organize what needed organizing. Benedict came back from town and took over the field with the ranch hands. Teresa looked after the house, and Mariana stayed. Not because it was the agreement. The agreement said nothing about hospitals or fractures or overnight vigils. She stayed because it made sense, because it was what she wanted to do. That recognition, simple and silent, came to her while she was sitting in the chair beside his bed in the middle of the night, when he slept with his face relaxed, younger than when he was awake, without the weight of everything he always carried. And she realized the worry she felt was not an employee's worry, not a contract partner's worry. It was something else, deeper, heavier, and lighter at the same time. It was someone who cares. August came back to the ranch in a wheelchair, which was the most irritating thing that had happened in his life. That was his own assessment, expressed to Benedict with an irritated frankness that made the old manager hide a discreet smile. He was a terrible patient, not in the dramatic sense. He wasn't the kind who shouted or threw things. It was worse. He was the kind who went quiet, tense, observing everything that happened around him with the frustration of someone used to fixing things and unable to do anything. Who tried to give instructions to everyone about everything, who kept a notebook and tried to manage the ranch from the chair, who at every visit from Benedict bombarded him with questions. Mariana established a rule in the second week. She entered the study where August was trying to calculate the costs of a barn renovation while keeping his leg elevated, and said, "The doctor said rest. Rest isn't working lying down." He looked up from the notebook. "There are things that can't wait." "Then tell me what can't wait and I'll handle it." A pause. "You?" "Me." She crossed her arms. Not defensively, in a way that said, "I'm firm on this. Me and Benedict. You know he knows this ranch like the back of his hand. And I," she hesitated a second, "have learned a lot in the past few months. I may not know everything, but I know enough to keep things from falling apart while you get better." The silence lasted longer than she expected. "You're not obligated to do this," he said at last. "I know." She looked him in the eyes. "I'm doing it because I want to, because it's the right thing to do." A pause. "Now tell me what can't wait." He looked at her for a long moment. There was in his expression something she had never seen there before. Not gratitude exactly, though that was there too. It was a kind of voluntary surrender, of someone used to depending on no one who suddenly discovers that depending on one specific person is not weakness. He opened the notebook to a page with a list and began to explain. The weeks that followed were the most demanding Mariana had ever lived, and she had been through a lot. She woke before 6, had a meeting with Benedict right after breakfast, visited the pasture when necessary, received supplies, handled bureaucratic matters. In the afternoon, when the day's urgencies were resolved, she went to August's room and gave the day's report, what she had done, what she had decided, what had been left open for him to guide. He listened carefully, sometimes agreed directly, sometimes asked a question that revealed an angle she hadn't considered. Rarely disagreed openly, but when he did, he said why, and the reason was always concrete and instructive, not just "because I said so." In these late afternoon conversations, with the sun coming through his bedroom window and the smell of grass coming from outside, they discovered what existed between them slowly, like someone unwrapping something fragile. He talked about his ex-wife one evening, not with bitterness, with a kind of tired distance, like someone talking about a storm that passed long ago. "She wasn't a bad person," he said. "She had just chosen wrong. I had too, in a way. I chose to think she would adapt because I wanted her to, not because there was any real reason to believe she would." "Were you honest with her before you married?" Mariana asked. "I thought so. But honesty has degrees, doesn't it?" He looked at the window. "I was honest about the facts, but not about who I really was. A man who prefers the ranch to anything else, who wakes up at night thinking about cattle and drought and cattle prices. She found that out later." Mariana was quiet for a moment. "I knew what I was getting into." He turned his face to her. There was a question in his expression that he didn't formulate. "I'm not complaining," she said before he needed to ask. "I'm saying it's different. You were honest with me from the start. That has value. You were too." He said it simply, as a statement. "You told me what you wanted. You didn't hide anything." "I had nothing to hide. My life was already open in everyone's mouth." "I didn't mean your history." He looked at her with those grey-green eyes she had spent months learning to read. I meant you, who you are. You don't hide that." It was the first compliment he had made directly, and it was so unexpected, so exactly the kind of thing she needed to hear, not about beauty, not about competence, but about character, that she didn't know what to answer for a moment. "Thank you," she said at last. The word felt small against what he had said, but it was the one she had. He nodded, as if to say no thanks were needed, as always. August's convalescence lasted nearly 2 months before he could walk again with a crutch. During that time, Mariana had managed the ranch with an efficiency that had surprised everyone, including herself. Benedict had said one morning, with all the seriousness he was capable of, "If I die, Miss Mariana, I can go in peace. The ranch is in good hands." She had answered that this was talk for lazy afternoons when he was 90, but good things rarely last without the shadow returning. It was Benedict who brought the news on an April afternoon, with that troubled expression Mariana could now read from a distance. "The old Ernesto's nephews have hired a new lawyer." Mariana was at the desk in the study. She set down the pen. "Who is it?" "A man from Dallas, specialized in inheritance law." Benedict paused. "He's filed a petition alleging that the boss's marriage is invalid, that it was a marriage of convenience, that it can be annulled." The air became heavier in the room. She knew, somewhere deep inside, that this was going to happen. She had waited for it, had even imagined how she would respond. But hearing it was different from imagining. What evidence are they basing it on? Someone talked. Benedict said this with a weight that went beyond the words. Someone from the town. Someone who knew how the contract had been made. She thought immediately of Rodrigo Cavanaugh. "Can we prove the tip came from him?" she asked. "Not directly, but the coincidences are many." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "How long do we have before a hearing?" "The lawyer says the petition will take about 2 months to be processed by the judge, but he's asking for an injunction to freeze the ranch's assets in the meantime." Injunction. If granted, the ranch would be paralyzed. The cattle sales contracts, which were at the right time, with good prices, would be impossible to execute. The ranch hands would go without pay. The entire structure that she and Benedict and August had kept running during his recovery could collapse within weeks. She stood up. "I'm going to talk to him. Miss Mariana. He needs to know now, not in a little while." August was on the porch, his crutch leaning on the railing, looking at the pasture with that distant gaze he had sometimes. The gaze of someone seeing the land in a way that goes beyond sight, who is somehow listening to it. She went to him and told him everything directly, without softening. He listened without interrupting. His face didn't change during the account, but she had learned to read the changes that happened beneath the surface. The tightening of his shoulders, the line of his jaw that became more tense. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "There's a lawyer in Hartwell who has worked with the ranch for years," he said. "Henry Carson. I'll call him today." "I already called him," she said. He turned to her slowly. "He'll come first thing tomorrow morning. I already told him what there was to tell, but you need to talk to him personally about the details of the will." She hesitated only a moment before continuing. "And we need to be honest with him about the nature of the marriage. He's trustworthy. He needs to be. Because if we're going to defend this, we're going to defend it with the truth, not with more lies." August looked at her for a time that seemed long. "You're never afraid to say what you think," he said. "I am." She didn't look away. "I just learned that silence costs more than speaking." Something passed across his face, a quick expression she couldn't entirely name, but which later, thinking about that moment, she would call recognition. Someone finally seeing clearly something that had been partially obscured. "All right," he said. "We go with the truth." The meeting with Henry Carson happened the next morning in the ranch's sitting room, with Mariana and August sitting on one side of the table and the lawyer, a man in his 60s with thick glasses and a calm manner, on the other. Benedict stayed nearby but didn't sit. They told everything: the agreement, the conditions, the reason for the contract, what had changed. And what had changed was said with a frankness that made clear both of them knew it had changed, even if neither of them had yet put it into exact words between themselves. Henry Carson listened with that particular attention good lawyers have, the attention of someone organizing the pieces as he listens. Then he took off his glasses, cleaned them with a cloth, put them back. The nephew's argument is that the marriage was simulated. To knock it down, they'll try to prove there was no real intention to build a life together, that it was only to satisfy a will clause. He paused. The question is, are they wrong? Silence in the room. When the clause was fulfilled, Henry continued, what existed between the two of you? August looked at Mariana. She looked at him. An agreement, he said. And now? Another pause. Longer. Now it's different, Mariana said. Simple, without drama, just the truth laid on the table, with the same objectivity with which he had laid the contract proposal months ago. August said nothing, but she saw from the corner of her eye that he nodded. Once. Slowly. Henry made a note. Good. Then what we're going to build is exactly that. What is true? That the marriage may have started as an agreement, but that the intention to build a life together exists. Are there letters, records of a joint account, witnesses of the cohabitation? He looked at Benedict. Benedict straightened in his chair. I've been on this ranch 20 years. I can testify to what I see every day. Teresa too, said Mariana. The hands, said August. Henry closed his notebook. We'll build a case. It'll take work, but it's solid. He left. The room was left with just the three, August, Mariana, and Benedict, who discreetly went to get himself coffee in the kitchen, leaving the two alone with the care of someone who knows there are things that need space to happen. August stood looking through the sitting room window at the oak tree in the yard. Mariana, he said. Yes. When you said it's different, he stopped. There was in him something she rarely saw. Hesitation. Not the hesitation of weakness, but the hesitation of someone about to say something that matters greatly and doesn't want to get the words wrong. Yes, she said again, softer. It's different. For me too. He turned toward her. And for the first time since she had known him, there was an expression on his face she didn't need to interpret. It was there, open, without armor. It was the expression of someone who had spent a long time alone and who, discovering he no longer needs to be, doesn't quite know how to move in this new territory, but is willing to learn. I don't know how to do this well, he said. I'll probably make mistakes. Me too. She looked at him. But two people can make mistakes together. It's different from making them alone. A silence. The wind moved the oak tree outside. It is, he said. And that was everything. The proceedings lasted 6 weeks of constant tension. Old Ernesto Drummond's nephews, Fabian and Carl, sons of the deceased sister who had lived in Dallas, had hired an aggressive lawyer from the big city who knew all the shortcuts. The injunction to freeze assets was requested based on documents that included, and this confirmed Mariana's suspicion, statements collected in Cedar Creek. Statements from people who had witnessed her situation before the marriage, manipulated to paint a picture of a desperate woman who had entered into a sham agreement. Rodrigo Kavanaugh's name never appeared directly. But Benedict, with the years and contacts that only a ranchman builds over decades, discovered that Rodrigo had met with Fabian Drummond twice in the previous months, in different cities. The line was clear, even if it wasn't legal proof. The injunction was denied by the judge. First victory. Henry Carson had built a solid argument about the continuity of ownership and the regular functioning of the ranch, which showed that the marriage, whatever it had been at the origin, had resulted in a real functional operation, and that freezing the assets would harm not only August, but the 8 workers who depended on the property. But the main proceedings continued, and a hearing was set for a May morning. The night before the hearing, Mariana could not sleep. She stayed on the porch until the middle of the night, with a mug of tea cooling in her hands, looking at the sky, which was extraordinarily clear. One of those country nights where the stars seem not like decoration, but like presence. She thought about what she had said in Cedar Creek before leaving. When there's only one path, you can't just stand still. She thought about how a path she had taken out of necessity had become something she would not trade for anything. She thought about her mother, who had called 2 days before with a voice more alive than it had been in years, saying her heart was doing well, that she had gone out to visit her friend for the first time in months, that Cedar Creek was the same daughter, but I don't let it bother me anymore. She thought of Benedict, of Teresa, of the ranch hands, of the garden that had bloomed. And she thought of August, who at that moment was probably lying in his room, with that distant look of someone thinking about what he can't control, and who tomorrow would need to stand up, firm, dignified, before relatives who wanted to tear away what his father had built with decades of work. She closed her eyes. She had learned throughout her life, and especially over the past months, that faith is not the absence of fear. It is the ability to keep moving forward, even with fear present. That was what she had done when she accepted the contract. That was what she had done when she faced Rodrigo at the gate. That was what she had done when she went down to the north pasture alone with a first aid kit and her heart in her throat to find an injured man. "Take care of us," she said to the sky quietly. It wasn't an extravagant request. She wasn't asking for a spectacular miracle. She was asking what she had always asked: clarity, strength, and that the truth be enough. Then she went inside and slept. The hearing was in the Hartwell County Courthouse, in a small room with a high ceiling, hard wooden chairs, and a slow ceiling fan in the morning heat. The judge was a man in his mid-50s, with a serious face and a gaze that went directly to the essential. The nephew's lawyer, a man in a grey suit, hair neatly combed, the confidence of someone accustomed to winning, presented the case with the technical fluency of someone who had organized the argument well. Simulation, marriage without genuine marital intent, a commercial arrangement disguised as matrimony. The statements collected in Cedar Creek were presented, voices of people who had witnessed Mariana's condition before, who described the situation of poverty and damaged reputation, insinuating she was a woman with no other option who had sold herself. Every word was calculated to diminish, to turn Mariana into a character of opportunism and desperation, and August into a man who had purchased a situation. Henry Carson presented the counter-argument with the calm Mariana had learned to recognize as the sign of someone who knows he holds good cards. The cohabitation documents, the contract signed by Mariana in the ranch's name during August's recovery. The improvements implemented, recorded, documented, verifiable. The letters written to her mother, which had been presented as evidence of real domestic life. And then the judge called the witnesses. Benedict went first. He spoke with the precision of someone who cares about every word, no exaggeration, no drama. He described what he had seen. The woman who had arrived with care, with caution, who had learned the ranch, who had taken over when the boss was incapacitated, who had made decisions with competence and with consultation, who had cared for the boss during his recovery. "How did the lady behave toward Mr. August?" the nephew's lawyer asked, trying to find a breach. "Like someone who cares," Benedict answered simply. "I don't know how to explain it any other way." Teresa came next. She was less eloquent, more direct. She said she had seen Mrs. Mariana open the windows of a house that had been closed for years, that she had seen her stay by the boss's side in the hospital without anyone needing to ask, that she had seen the two of them on the porch talking until the sun went down, which the boss had never done with anyone in the 20 years she had known the ranch. The lawyer tried to discredit. "You're the defendant's employee. Your testimony is biased." But the judge made a note and did not indicate he had dismissed what had been said. Then Mariana was called. She sat in the witness chair, her hands on her knee, her back straight. The nephew's lawyer stood with an expression of someone about to be efficient. "Did you know Mr. August Drummond before the marriage?" "No." "Was the marriage proposed through an intermediary?" "Yes." "And the conditions of this marriage included financial benefits for you?" "They included financial support for my mother, medical treatment for her, and a monthly amount, yes." "Then you confirm the marriage was a commercial agreement?" "I confirm it started that way." "And now?" She was quiet for a moment. Not from hesitation, from care with the words. She had learned in the hard school of the past months that the right words spoken calmly are worth more than the best words spoken in haste. "Now it's a marriage," she said. "Can you elaborate?" "A marriage is a choice that two people make to build a life together. It can start in different ways. Mine started as an agreement between two people who needed specific things. Over time, the agreement gained other layers: trust, respect, care." She looked at the lawyer without looking away. "When your husband is pinned under a beam in a remote pasture and you drop everything to go to him, it's not because of a contract. It's because you care. I care about August Drummond." There was a silence in the room. The lawyer tried to find another angle. "You don't deny that the marriage was constructed to satisfy the will clause?" "I don't deny that was its initial motivation. I deny that it's only that today." "How can you prove that?" She didn't respond immediately, then said, with a simplicity more powerful than any rhetoric, "I can't prove what exists in another person's heart. I can only prove what I've done. And what I've done is documented." The judge made a long note. August was the last to testify. He had spent the weeks of recovery learning to accept help, to talk about things that normally stayed buried in silence, to recognize that the ranch that had been the center of everything had gained a new dimension with one specific person in it. And he had learned, too, to put that into words when necessary. When the nephew's lawyer tried the same line, the marriage was a commercial agreement, August looked at him with that calm that was, in practice, a form of wall. "The marriage started as an agreement. It continues as a marriage. These two things don't contradict each other." He paused. "My father put that clause in the will because he believed a married man is a more responsible man. He wasn't wrong. He just didn't know that responsibility would become something more." "Can you explain?" "My wife managed this ranch for 2 months while I recovered from a fracture. She made decisions I would have made, and some I wouldn't have made that were better than mine. She cared for me with a competence and a care that go beyond any written agreement." A pause. "That is a marriage. It's not the marriage I had imagined having, but it's what I have, and it's what I choose." The room was quiet. The judge looked for a long moment at the notebook where he had been making notes, then looked up. "I'll close today's session and issue the decision in 10 business days, he said. The 10 days were the longest of Mariana's life. Not because she feared the result. She had faith, genuine, the kind of faith that is not naivety, but the conviction that truth, when placed honestly before someone willing to hear it, carries weight. But waiting always weighs. She continued the ranch routine, continued the garden, continued the planning meetings which she and August now held together without needing Benedict as intermediary. His leg was better, still with a crutch, but better, and there were days he went without it for short periods, walking slowly, but walking. One afternoon he went to the garden. He stood looking at the rows of plants for a moment. "You planted all of this," he said, knowing the answer. "Yes." Nothing had ever grown here before. There was no one who believed it would grow. He was quiet. Then, "Mariana." "Yes." "When this is over, the judge's decision, the proceedings, all of it." He stopped, choosing his words with that care she had learned to recognize as respect. "I'd like you to stay, not because of the contract, not because of the ranch." A pause. "For me." She stood looking at him in the afternoon sun, her hands in the earth, her knees muddy. "I was already staying," she said, "for some time now." And it was that simple. There was no dramatic declaration, no music, no scene of the kind that stories sometimes invent. There were two adults who had been through difficult things, and who, from one side and the other of a hard life, had found in each other something they didn't know they could still have. That was enough. It was more than enough. The verdict came on a Thursday morning by email to Henry Carson, who called the ranch immediately. The judge had decided in August's favor. The decision was extensive. Henry read the main passages over the phone, and among the reasons was one that stayed in Mariana's memory for a long time afterward. The judge had written that the central question was not the marriage's origin, but its present nature, and that the evidence presented, documentary, testimonial, and through the documented behavior of both parties, demonstrated a genuine cohabitation that went beyond any original contractual agreement. The injunction request was definitively denied. The nephew's lawsuit was dismissed. Santa Cruz Ranch was, without contest, the property of August Venancio Drummond. The celebration at the ranch was simple, the only kind August knew how to do, which was the real kind, without affectation. Teresa made a larger lunch than usual, with beef on the grill and the ranch hands around the long table on the covered porch. Benedict opened a bottle of good whiskey he had kept for the right occasion, without specifying how long he'd been waiting. There was laughter, there was talk, there was that joy of work that is more solid than any other, because it was earned. August stood looking at all of that for a moment, the people, the table, the ranch in the background, and Mariana, who was serving Teresa's plate before her own, with that naturalness of someone who had learned that serving is not diminishing oneself, but is caring. And there was in him an expression that Benedict, who had known him for 20 years, had never seen. It was peace, the specific peace of someone who has discovered he is not alone. Rodrigo Cavanaugh was never formally charged with anything. There was no direct evidence, only coincidences that Henry Carson had carefully documented. But Benedict, with his quiet efficiency, had passed the right message in the right places, and in certain circles, reputation functions as its own sentence. Rodrigo had lost an important contract with a county agency in the region where the Drummond family had influence. Not through direct retaliation, but because the world sometimes functions with a kind of natural balance that doesn't need human intervention to adjust itself. Mariana learned about this later through Benedict and felt no joy in another person's misfortune. She felt only distance, the distance of someone who has passed through the pain that man had caused and no longer needs to carry the weight of what he was. It was freedom, simple as that. July arrived with good rain, the kind of July rain in the country that isn't a storm, but is providence, that enters the dried earth and goes deep before stopping. Mariana was on the porch in the morning, standing, with her bare feet on the cool tile floor, listening to the rain on the tin roof, with a cup of coffee in her hands. August appeared beside her without her hearing him come. He had learned to walk without a crutch the previous week, and there was still care in his step, but it was almost imperceptible. He stood beside her, looking at the rain. "Good for the garden," he said. "Good for everything." A pause. The rain was the only sound. "My mother called yesterday," she said. "The doctor said her heart is in excellent condition, that with the right medications she has the prospect of quality life for many more years. Good news. The best." She closed her eyes for a second, feeling the rain on her face slightly from the wind. "She wants to come visit. She can come whenever she wants. The house is big." She turned to his side. He was looking at the rain, with that serious profile she had learned to love. Yes, love. The word existed inside her now without her needing to examine it from every angle. It was just the truth. And there was, in his features, that peace that had appeared slowly, like the garden, like trust, like everything that matters. "August." "Thank you." He turned toward her. The expression was one of slight puzzlement. Whenever she thanked him for something he considered obvious, he looked like that, as if he didn't know what to do with gratitude. "For what?" "For choosing me." She looked at him. "I know you needed a wife, but you had other options. You chose me." A pause. Someone the town had discarded, someone most men wouldn't have wanted even for a contract, afraid of what people would say. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I knew when Benedict described the situation that there were two types of woman in that story. The one who had been deceived and the one who had acted in bad faith. Those are completely different things." A pause. "You had been deceived. You had done nothing wrong. What the town chose to do with that was the town's problem, not yours." It was the longest and clearest defense he had made out loud of a judgment she knew he had made since the beginning. And hearing it like that, direct, without circumlocution, was one of the most beautiful things she had ever heard. "You're a good person," she said. "I'm not." The way he said it was direct, without false modesty. "I'm stubborn, impatient, and I stay up at night thinking about cattle prices when I should be sleeping, but I try to be fair." A pause. "And I learned over time that doing the right thing isn't hard when you know what's right." "Who taught you that?" "My mother. And you these past months." She stood looking at him. The rain continued on the roof. The oak tree in the yard swayed slowly. "When the contract ends," she said, "the 1-year period, I want to stay, not as an agreement, as a choice. I've already said I want the same. I know. I just wanted to say it again, with these words." He looked at her, and then, for the first time since she had known him, for the first time on that face which had been serious throughout all those months of living together, he smiled. Not the contained smile of when something surprised him pleasantly. A real smile, open, the kind that completely changes a face, that removes years and adds light. It was the same smile as the boy of 8 in the photo on the horse Thunder. She thought she would keep that smile forever. And she did. 1 year later, Santa Cruz Ranch had grown. Not dramatically. That wasn't August's way of growing with haste. It was solid growth built on right decisions and constant work. They had opened a small dairy processing operation on the property, Mariana's idea that she had developed on top of the planning conversations, which eliminated the middleman and increased the margin. They had hired 2 more employees. The garden had expanded to an area 3 times the original, and part of the produce went to a small farmer's market in the county that Teresa organized on Fridays, with a joy Mariana had never seen in her before it happened. Benedict had celebrated 65 years with a lunch that Mariana had prepared herself, the kind of celebration that doesn't need a card, but needs presents and food made with attention, which is the same thing. The old manager had gotten misty-eyed in a way he later categorically denied, saying it was dust. Mariana's mother had visited for a month and had slept in the guest room near the oak tree, and had woken every morning with the expression of someone who doesn't believe they have the right to be well, but who is discovering they do. "This ranch heals," she had said one afternoon to her daughter, while the two of them weeded the basil bed side by side. And Mariana had answered, "I think it's the people who care for the ranch that heal, Mom." Mrs. Conchicao had stood looking at her for a long moment, then had looked in the direction where August was, far off in the pasture, a small figure against the wide horizon, and had said slowly, "Your mother didn't get everything wrong in this life after all." They had laughed, a loud, clean laugh, the kind that comes from a deep place. On an October afternoon, exactly 1 year after Mariana's arrival at the ranch, August asked her to come to the porch after dinner. She went. The sky was extraordinary, that purple of a country sunset that looks painted with exaggeration but is real, is always real. He was on the porch with a small wooden box in his hands. His expression was the usual one, serious, direct, but there was a nervousness underneath it she had never seen in him before, and which made her heart race before he said a single word. "I'm not good at speeches," he said. "I know. But some things need to be said out loud to be real." He opened the box. Inside was a ring. Simple, without excess, gold with a small brown stone that took her a moment to recognize as Tiger's Eye. This ring was my mother's. The only one she had that wasn't for special occasions, that she wore every day. Mariana said nothing. She couldn't. "I want you to wear it every day, too." He looked at her. "Not because the contract says we're married, because I choose to be married to you, because you were the most unexpected and most right thing to happen on this ranch in a long time." A pause. "And because this ranch, this land, this work, this place is larger and more alive with you in it." She looked at the ring, looked at his hands holding the box, the worker's hands she had learned to recognize as the hands of a man who builds, not destroys. Looked at him. "Say it back to me," she said, her voice a little thin, "what you feel in those words." He did not look away. "I love you, Mariana." Simple, without adornment, exactly the way he was. She brought her hand to her mouth for a second, then, "I love you too." Her voice trembled a little, but it was the trembling of someone who has reached solid ground after a long swim, not of someone who is falling. "For longer than I can say exactly." He placed the ring on her finger. She looked at the brown stone gleaming in the last ray of sun going down behind the hills. The oak tree in the yard swayed slowly. The sounds of the ranch came into the night, the distant lowing, the owl she no longer found strange, the wind that was like breathing. She stood looking at the horizon beside August, shoulder to shoulder, the way they had stood that day when he had placed himself beside her at the gate before Rodrigo, except then it was different. Then it was a contract defending an appearance. Now it was a life. "Benedict is going to cry again and deny it again," she said. He made that low sound that was his laugh when he didn't let the laugh come out fully. "He will. Teresa is going to make a 3-course lunch. Also. And I'm going to stay here." She turned to him. "Forever, if I can." "You can." He placed his hand over hers with the firmness of always, that firmness that was not possessiveness, but certainty. "You can." There is an old belief among those who live off the land that the ranch feels what happens inside it, that the earth absorbs sadness and joy the same way it absorbs rain, stores it inside, transforms it, returns it at the next harvest in one way or another. Santa Cruz Ranch had stored much in the years before Mariana arrived. It had stored the loneliness of a man who loved what he built, but had forgotten to love who was near. It had stored the silence of closed windows and conversations that never happened, and smiles nobody remembered to give. And then came a woman with calloused hands and eyes that still believed, despite everything, that planting something is always a bet worth making. And the ranch bloomed, not overnight, not with any cinematic miracle. It bloomed the way real things bloom, slowly, silently, day after day of work and choice and presence. The same way the garden had grown, trust had grown, love had grown, without announcement, without fanfare, simply becoming real before either of them had the courage to call it by name. Mrs. Conceição came back to visit on holidays and other occasions, and there was one afternoon she stayed in the big kitchen with Teresa, talking as if they had known each other for decades. And Mariana passed by the doorway and saw them like that, and stood for a second watching, with that feeling of seeing something that is exactly as it should be. Benedict formally retired 2 years later, but kept showing up every morning just to take a look, which meant he stayed until noon taking care of things and having Teresa's coffee. Nobody said anything. August learned over time that smiling doesn't cost what he had imagined it did. He remained the same man of few words and constant work who woke early and thought about cattle prices and the weather. But there was a lightness in him that Benedict, in his most honest moments, said was the only thing the man had been missing to be complete. And Mariana, who had arrived at Santa Cruz Ranch carrying the weight of a shame that was not hers, of a story that others had written about her without her permission, went on writing her own story. Line by line, day by day, choice by choice. She discovered that dignity is not what people on the outside grant you. It's what you keep inside, even when everything around you tries to convince you that you don't deserve it. She discovered that real love doesn't arrive with fanfare or with easy promises. It arrives slowly, calmly, like the July rain, enters deep and stays. And she discovered, perhaps the most important discovery of all, that when you are honest about who you are, when you don't hide your weakness but don't hide your strength either, the right people find you. Not all people. Not the people the town approved, but the right ones. One day, 2 years after the wedding, Mariana was planting new flowers in front of the house. Not out of necessity, just because she wanted to, because she had learned that planting beautiful things is an act of faith that there will be a tomorrow. When she stopped and looked around, she saw the yard with the oak tree that must have been 50 years old and would last another 50. She saw the garden she had started from nothing. She saw the house that had learned to breathe again. She saw August far off in the pasture, and she knew that when he came back for lunch, he would rest his hand on her shoulder in passing, as he always did now, that small and constant gesture that was the language he had found to say what was still hard to put into words, but which she understood completely. She put her hand in the earth. It was warm. It was living earth, the kind that absorbs and transforms and returns. "Thank you," she said quietly. It wasn't to anyone specific. It was to the sky, to the earth, to that set of coincidences and choices and moments of despair that had brought her here, to this place she hadn't asked for, but which had become the only place in the world where she could have bloomed in this way. The wind moved the oak tree. Santa Cruz Ranch answered in the only language it knew. The smell of earth, the green of the pastures, the distant lowing, the immense sky of the country that has no ceiling and no limit. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was a life.